Well, I'm assuming that all of you are here because you're interested in religious revivals, because that's what the subject is tonight. I plan to tell you more than you probably ever wanted to know about revivals, because this is the subject of my thesis work that I actually did in 2013. So I did the same talk exactly 10 years ago, right after I graduated. So I graduated from the American New England Studies program, as Katie mentioned. And I just wanted, I don't know if you've heard of the program, it's not there anymore, but it's a fantastic program, and many of the people in cultural institutions in Maine actually graduated from that program. So I'd just like to show you an illustration of why the people that are part of American New England Studies are sort of characters. So this is a statue of John Harvard, and for good luck, at Harvard, they rub the toe, the boot of John Harvard. At Yale, they rub the toe of Theodore Woolsey there, okay? But in American New England Studies, we kiss the statue of Robert Frost. And this is me. I actually started the tradition in New England Studies, and I may be the only one that's ever done it. So anyway. So this is an outline of the things that we're hoping to discuss. When I did it 10 years ago, I think I had gone through about half my slides, and it was an hour had passed. So I've tried to sort of shorten and condense. There's lots of information. My thesis was 400 pages long. So I've done lots and lots of studies about this particular revival. So I'm trying to show a summary of what I've learned. But this is basically an outline of what we plan to talk about, the movement and its significance, the church foundation and religious climate, the minister, whose name was Tristram Gilman, the revival details, which will be a fascinating part, the role of death and fear, the role of the laity and other ministers, and I'm going to look at some stats and demographics and tell you what they show. And then lastly, I'll talk about the legacy of the revival and some conclusions. So first of all, I need you to know which church we're talking about here. When you hear about the First Parish Church in Yarmouth, it was back in the day called the First Parish Church of North Yarmouth, and at the time when the revival happened in the 1790s, that included 3 churches that are still working today. The primary one is the First Parish Church, which is right on Main Street, and then we've got the North Yarmouth Congregational Church and the Cumberland Church. So you'll see when I start talking about this revival that the revival actually happened at a place called, at the time, the Meeting House Under the Ledge. I'm sure many of you that know Yarmouth history know that this was the original church, and at that time it included 6 different towns. So the church was actually located, it's been gone since 1936. This red triangle shows where it was. So this is Route 88, this is Gilman Road and Garrison Lane. It's roughly right about here is where they believe the church was. This is a painting that we have because it was taken down before photography. That's all we have is a painting of the Meeting House Under the Ledge, which was built in 1729. As I said, it was taken down in 1836. Just to give you a few more details about where it is, here's another painting that George Allen did. And it's kind of fun because there's a little blockhouse nearby protecting this, because it was the 18th century when there was still a lot of conflict with the native people. So they needed to protect their church, and there's a story that there was actually ammunition stored up in the balcony areas of the church. So here's the site of where the church used to be. It's right next to the Ami Cutter House, who was the first minister of the First Parish Church. And there is a plaque embedded in a stone, and this is what it says: the site of the first meeting house in ancient North Yarmouth, erected 1730. This stone is the doorstep of the east entrance. So this is where the stone is. And the stone is located right about here in the yard of this house. So you can still see that. So now when they say the east entrance, I don't know if anyone knows for sure, but you can see there are 2 east entrances. So it could be this one or this one that is showing. And I believe that's thought to be anyway in its original location. So that's the church we're talking about that experienced this revival. Now I'd like to talk to you about, I'm just going to show this profile of a revival to sort of define what I mean by revival. Okay, a revival looks like this. And so I'm showing you the years before and after the revival. The revival started in 1791 and was kind of complete by 1793. What you see is that you always see sort of up and down with church membership over time, but a revival is defined by this very rapid spike in church membership particularly, that happens over a very short period of time. So this shows the number of members added, and you can see that it was quite dramatic and also short-lived. So that's one of the features of a revival. Another feature of a revival is that it doesn't just include increases in church membership, it also increases sort of the general interest in religion, what people at the time would call a quickening, such that the people that were in the church at the time experienced quickening, which means that they were very, very interested in religion. So they joined the church, but they also went to the church a lot, and they went to all kinds of prayer meetings together and just did all kinds of things associated with religion. One of the reasons that this particular revival is important is that revival has not been well studied in Maine or even northern New England. There's some information about the revivals that happened in the First Great Awakening, which I'll describe in a minute, in York, but basically no one has really studied any of the revivals that happened up here in Maine and even Vermont and New Hampshire. So this work is kind of important because it's the first sort of detailed description of revivals. It was thought by historians who have written about this, people have known about it, and they say, oh, there was this revival that happened in the 1790s in North Yarmouth, but people have thought that it was actually associated with what's called the Second Great Awakening, which I'll describe also. The Second Great Awakening occurred around 1800, but as you'll see, I show that this event was actually a completely isolated event. It was very different than what was happening with the Second Great Awakening. It was also a very distinctive revival in that at the time that it happened, congregationalism throughout the state of Maine was in rapid decline. Sects were growing. Okay, so sects, S-E-C-T-S, is the name of all of the other church groups that were not congregational. When Maine was actually founded, or at least the southern part of Maine was founded as a Puritan state, which, you know, we're part of Massachusetts, and so the order of the day was that all towns had to have a congregational church, and the other churches like Baptists and Methodists and all the other sects that came later. But initially, when the towns were founded, they had to be congregational churches. So I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The other thing that was distinctive about this revival is that the minister was older and had been there for 20 years when it happened. What you'll often see, and you probably even see this today, that when there's a new minister, people are excited, they start coming to church. But this guy had been there for 20 years when the revival happened. So that's another thing that's a little bit different about this, or distinctive about this revival. It was also very distinct from the different revivals that were happening down in Connecticut that were part of this New Divinity movement, which I'll explain a little bit more. That didn't actually happen in Maine at all in the late 18th century, so it wasn't part of that same movement. So what did this look like? Well, just to give you an example and think about, you know, how dramatic this kind of increase in church membership was, is that the number of 148 members joined the church over a period of about 2.5 years. So it more than doubled the size of the church. And most of the growth was actually rapid. 2/3 of it happened in the first 8 months. So you can see it was a very dramatic. Imagine going to church and all of a sudden there's a lot more people that come. So that's what it looked like and joined. It was the largest congregational revival in Maine since the First Great Awakening, which I'll describe. And perhaps even through the 1800s. It's a very dramatic revival. Locally, it was larger than even the First Great Awakening, which was a widespread awakening that happened throughout New England. And at that time, there were 80 people that were added over 8 years. So see, by comparison, we've got 148 new members in just 2.5 years. So it's the largest in the church's 293-year history. So now we're going to switch gears here and talk about the church foundation religious climate. So I'm going to go into some detail here because all of this is important for you to understand how the revival happened. So it's a little bit complicated, but I want you to understand what all the different parts of it are. So first we'll start out talking about the church foundation. So I bring this up to show you, this is something that we talked about quite a bit in New England Studies. My professor, Joe Conforti, used to share this with the class. And the reason that we talk about this is because when you think about the past, it's good to think of it like a foreign country, because the culture is very, very different, particularly this far back in time. So join me now as we go back in the past, and please think about this as if you're entering a foreign country that you don't understand anything about. Reserve any judgment for how the people thought, because they thought very differently back then. But let's together just try to understand what they were thinking about at the time, because those are the things that affected what happened to them in the church. So the first thing we have to talk about in great detail is this quick course I'm going to tell you that's going to be called Calvinism 101. So you're going to hear that word a lot throughout this talk, because the revival is centered at the theology associated with the church, which was Calvinism. This is John Calvin. He's born in the 16th century, born and lived in the 16th century. He's the one that invented or came up with the idea of Calvinism, of course. But this was a very important movement that was taken up by the Puritans who settled in Massachusetts, but also what we know as the Pilgrims. You're all familiar with them. The Presbyterians, all of this in the 17th and 18th century. Later, other groups actually take up Calvinism as well, like the Baptists. So I'm just going to describe to you, again, what they believed, okay? At the center of Calvinism is this idea that God is sovereign. And this is very important. I put a period there intentionally. God is sovereign, period. Okay, this is what Calvinists believe. And second of all, we've got 5 different components of Calvinism. And we used to remember these in my coursework by the acronym TULIP. Okay, so the first one is total depravity. That's something you probably is easy to understand, and you've heard about that a lot. What that means is that the Calvinists believe that when babies are born, when we come into the world, that they're totally filled with sin. They're totally depraved. Okay, so that's a very core belief in Calvinism. The next one is unconditional election. Okay, so what this means, I've put stars by this because this ends up being an important part of the revival and the entire history of Calvinism, really, because this is the one that is the kind of the biggest sticking point, if you will, with Calvinism. So unconditional election means the elect. Okay, you've probably heard that Calvinists believe that God calls his elect, and it's a subset of all the people on the earth. They actually call themselves saints. So the people that God called were his elect. Unconditional, which means that there was nothing that a person could do to affect this in any way. This is entirely God's choice, okay, to pick you, if you will. You could be as good as you want or as bad as you want, and if he's picked you, you're picked, okay? So it's unconditional. So again, as I've started this, because this is the part that over time with different theologies that are developing becomes the biggest sticking point, because people don't like that idea. Like, seriously, there's nothing I can do to be, to affect God, nothing I would do. So, but that's a central part of Calvinism. The third one, limited atonement, what this means is that Jesus died on the cross just for the elect. Okay, so that's another little sticking point, right? Because some people that are like free will, Baptists, etc., believe that they died for everyone, right? Not just the elect. So that's also a little bit of a difficult point in Calvinism. The last two are pretty easy. Irresistible grace is how God draws the elect, and the perseverance of the saints. So in other words, once you are known to be the elect, you will persevere throughout your life. So those are the major tenets of Calvinism. And the important thing to realize here in thinking about our revival is that when people became a member of the church, as I showed you, 148 people in 2.5 years, they had to have experienced something called regeneration, which people also call it rebirth. Basically, it just means that the way to think of it is that you're a new person, you have a new heart, you're entirely different. And this is proven by your public profession with what's called an experience or relation. So these are things that we actually have historic documents. I believe there's some here at Yarmouth Historical Society, Yarmouth History Center, and they're descriptions of how God has worked in their lives. Okay, so we've got recordings of some of these, but if you wanted to become a member of the church, you had to write and stand up in front of the church and read or describe your experience or relation. So regeneration was at the core of their belief. So it's very different today when, mostly if you want to join a church, you can. Here you have to actually have experienced this life-changing thing called regeneration. So now I'm going to jump back and talk a little bit about the thing I've mentioned, the First Great Awakening. So the First Great Awakening was kind of the first time that this concept of regeneration was challenging Calvinism. So Calvinism had been around for almost 200 years, but something unusual happened. And it actually started in England, but it spread throughout. It was in Scotland and Germany as well, but it was very dramatic here in New England as well. So it happened in the 1730s and 1740s, and there was this widespread revival where all kinds of people were joining churches in all kinds of churches. So they called it the First Great Awakening because it was this really dramatic thing that was happening during this time. Well, so one of the things that came out of this First Great Awakening is that the idea of regeneration sort of started changing. And well, it changed for some of the people. So regeneration was something that all Calvinists believed in, but what it looked like was different depending on if you were a subject, if you will, of revival or not. So all of them feature something like a profound, these three steps I'm going to describe. But in the case of the people who were changed during the First Great Awakening, it was a very emotional experience. It was something very visual. So you can see here are some people who are being affected by step one, which is the profound conviction of sin. These are people who, I got this from pbs.org, God in America, showing images of these people who are suddenly feeling the weight of the sin on them, the total depravity, right? So here's the first step. And you can see, again, this is visible. So that's kind of the thing that is important here to know, is why the First Great Awakening sort of changed how people thought about this. The second step is peace by turning to God. Okay, so now these people are showing, they feel peaceful because they feel profoundly sinful, and then they're relieved by turning to God. And then the third step is a conscious change of purpose. So I'm illustrating this with, you guys have all heard of the Apostle Paul, who had such a dramatic change in his purpose that he actually went from being Saul, the persecutor of the Jews. God knocked him off his horse and said, Saul, why are you persecuting my people? He was completely changed and became the Apostle Paul, and as you all know what happened with him. So that's a very dramatic and conscious change of purpose. So those are the three steps that happened with regeneration. But the problem was that when some people started experiencing that level of a very emotional, enthusiastic response, they wondered who really was the elect. Okay, were these people the first people who really were the elect? So people started talking about what does it look like to be regenerate? And there was a schism in the congregational churches, in the Calvinist churches. And the schism was like this, represented by this guy, Charles Chauncey, who was very vocal about it, and then this other guy, George Whitefield. And they came to be known as Old Lights, and they were against revival, and I'll tell you why, and New Lights, who were pro-revival. So this man, George Whitefield, started over in England. He came over to the United States. He traveled by horseback. He had a folding pulpit. He'd set up his pulpit in the middle of a cornfield, and thousands of people would come to hear him, like literally thousands. It was just this crazy time, and this was during the 1730s and the 1740s. And so he got this reputation. Wherever he'd go, he'd bring all these people in to the church. Now, as I said, some of these old staid Congregationalists, a lot of them at Harvard, said, that's not regeneration. I don't believe in that. That's just a bunch of emotional hooey. It's going to go away soon. And so they, stood down very hard against revival. And the main thing at the center was, what did regeneration look like? Because before we had this big, great awakening, people would say, oh, I'm part of the elect. I've experienced this change. But all of a sudden, it looks really different. So what is regeneration really like? So basically, the Old Lights, who were opposed to revival, said that the change to becoming regenerate was gradual. Okay, it was slow. It could happen over many, many years. Whereas the New Light pro-revival people would say it was sudden. It was something that typically just affected you and then you were different, sort of suddenly. The other aspect of this, which I'm going to bring up a few times, so you got to know what it means, is the halfway covenant. So what happened is, after all the Puritans began the big Puritan migration in the 1640s, 40,000 Puritans came over from England and settled in Massachusetts. After the first generation, and they started a government based on their, who were the elect. Okay, the elect were the special people who ran the government as well. Well, that was all well and good, except by the second generation, there was already problems where the people weren't becoming the children of the elect were not appearing to become saints. And so what did they do about that is they started this thing called the halfway covenant, which meant that if you just professed that you believed in this religion, you could have your children baptized. And then people got back to baptizing their infants. The Congregationalists baptized infants. So that sort of helped. So it was like you could be a halfway member. Now, only full members could actually take communion. But halfway members, in other words, if you just stand up and say, I believe all of this, you could have your children baptized. So that sort of helped with the degradation that was happening over time. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some other terms here that you need to understand. So this guy, Jonathan Edwards, if you've heard him before, he was a classic New Light at the same time that George Whitefield was. He had a church in Northampton, and his church experienced some amazing revivals. And he also, during the First Great Awakening, and he also wrote quite a bit about what the experience was like. So the important thing about Jonathan Edwards is that he was an Orthodox Calvinist, okay? So he's someone who followed, let's just say, Calvinism to a T, tulip. All of those things he believed in, all of their ramifications. So he was an Orthodox minister. Now he had some students who actually developed sort of a new form of Calvinism, which was, if anything, a little bit more intense, and they were called the hyper-Calvinists. Okay, this guy, Samuel Hopkins, who was a student of Jonathan Edwards, was part of the New Divinity movement. I'm not going to particularly mention a lot about this, but just so that you're aware, when we look at this chart, okay, so this is an important chart to sort of understand. Okay, starting at 1700 and going up to 1850. So these two words are important because these things were happening at the same time. So this is at the foundation of the First Parish Church. We've got the Orthodox, okay, orthodoxy as defined by Jonathan Edwards, people who are following Calvinism to the T. And then we've got a divergent form, which is known as Arminianism. Okay, and so you'll hear during that time period, especially the first and middle part of the 18th century, you're going to hear people start talking about Arminianism. Well, it turns out that Arminianism is the root of these other, what the Congregationalists saw as bad, diversions from orthodoxy, because particularly what this meant, it was very, very subtle, but I've seen it described in sermons. Arminianism was this subtle, that you had anything at all to do with your own conversion was an Arminian idea, okay? Because that goes away from the standard Orthodox view that Calvinists had, which is that, you know, there's nothing you can do. God picks you, there's nothing you can do. So we're going to talk a little bit about, you'll hear this word Arminianism, and they were sort of in contrast. Now, as I just mentioned, another sort of hyper orthodoxy was the New Divinity, which started around the 1780s. And then Arminianism actually broke into this free will theology that started in the 1780s, which included all these groups that you know of, the Quakers, the Shakers, the Methodists, the Free Will Baptists, and the Universalists. They all believed in free will. In other words, it's my own free will. If I want to believe in God, I can. If I want to be part of his kingdom, I can. My choice, free will. But again, that's antithetical to the Calvinist belief. Okay? But the important thing to realize here, and this is what I'm going to be talking about, is the First Parish Church in North Yarmouth actually stays on this path pretty well. Not all the way out to here, but through here anyway. Orthodoxy, okay, is what is at the heart of the First Parish Church, and I'll show you evidence of that. Let's see, before we do, I want to just go back and just describe this. What I wanted to say was that North Yarmouth, okay, when I say North Yarmouth, I'm talking about the 6 towns. So at this time in 1790s, it included Cumberland and what's now North Yarmouth and Yarmouth. They were decidedly New Light. And the reason that they were is because most of the first settlers that came in the 1730s were from the Plymouth colony, which was very New Light. So in other words, pro-revival. Okay, so the church foundation, the First Parish Church Foundation, is decidedly New Light. There were some people from Boston who tended to be mixed, okay, who migrated up from Boston. So we've got a little bit of dissent, but the real core starting out with the First Parish Church is really New Light. Okay, well, it turns out that we can actually tell a lot about what the people thought by looking, and what they believed about religion by looking at some documents that have survived, particularly this John Lewis's journal. So he was a deacon in the First Parish Church. And so up through the 18th century, all of the ministers that had been part of the First Parish Church, so when I'm saying First Parish, I'm talking about that meeting house under the hill, under the ledge, that church, right? The one that was the progenitor of all the current churches. So it's the old church, and all in the 18th century, all of the the ministers were Harvard educated, which leaned towards Old Light and Arminianism. And if you think about it, the reason is that they're intellectuals, right? And so they would be more leaning towards the intellectual approach to becoming regenerate. The first minister was a Harvard minister whose name was Ami Cutter, and he was actually relieved because of his Arminianism. The next one was a very good, strong Orthodox Calvinist, the Reverend Nicholas Loring, of whom we have a descendant sitting in the front row. And the one after that was another Arminian, before Tristram Gilman came. So I'm just telling you what were the ministers like before Tristram Gilman shows up in 1769. So we've got a record that says, Mr. Cutter gave great offense by his rank Arminianism. So this is a classic line that we've all heard. It's been recorded. And so what does that even mean? I remember when I first heard that, I'm like, what? But believe me, it's very subtle. It's incredibly subtle. Brooks, who was the one after Loring, he was in the 1760s basically. The church had changed some by then. There were some more factions, but you can see actually during this time period, John Lewis records some particular things. He recorded every single sermon that he attended, the date, and he wrote a little note about what he thought about it. So this is a really great thing to sort of reveal at least his ideas about who was preaching what they were saying. So in this, he wrote that Brooks said that repentance and conversion were near synonymous. That's how subtle it is, everyone. That repentance and conversion were the same things in Scripture, and it served no good purpose to keep up a distinction. So are you guys appreciating the subtle distinction there? That basically repentance is something a person can do, and so that if you repent, you're converted. But that's a no-no for the strong Calvinists. That's how subtle Arminianism was. They don't want any preaching, anyone even beginning to insinuate that there's anything anyone can do to become part of the elect. The Orthodox faction, which included John Lewis, actually prevailed, as you're going to see. And under Gilman, the next minister to come along, they were actually unified. But just to show you that that's not necessarily the case, down in Portland, they started with an Orthodox Calvinist minister, Thomas Smith, and he was followed up by his partner, Samuel Dean, who was an Arminian. He was a rank Arminian, and we've got all kinds of records showing that. And so this church, as you know, actually became Unitarian. So it's interesting to see that. You can see that connection very early on, even into the 18th century, where you have the church leaning towards Arminianism, and now they've gone towards this complete Arminian theology, which is the Unitarian. So I just wanted to share this quote with you because I think it's entertaining. John Quincy Adams apparently wrote in his diary after hearing this guy Samuel Dean preach in 1786 that the whining sort of tone he used would have injured the sermons if they had been good. How about that? That's kind of doesn't get any worse than that, does it? So we can sort of imagine what it was like to sit under Samuel Dean. Now I'm going to describe the religious climate, and again, we're getting a little complicated here, but this is all important stuff. So as I was describing, we've got the First Great Awakening, 1730s and 1740s. Then we skip to the Second Great Awakening. I can't go into detail. You have to read my thesis if you want to know. It was a different event. It happened starting around 1800. Okay, the 1791 revival is here as an isolated, different event, which was very different than the Second Great Awakening, which was also widespread, but it happened throughout the United States, the states that were there at the time. Now, there's been a new sort of time period that's been defined by a historian named Stephen Marini, and he's called it the New Light Stir. And those of you who are historians will sort of notice that there's a nice the dates in the New Light Stir exactly line up with the American Revolution. So what was happening at this time was that there wasn't a lot of interest in religion. In fact, by everyone's accounts, this is in Maine anyway, Lewis says in 1771, low state of religion in general. The church memberships were staying the same or maybe even decreasing. It was a very, very low time period for congregationalism. And one of the ideas that Marini has is that what might have been happening here is that there was some pushback towards the Congregational Church, which was basically, as people were doing during the American Revolution, they wanted to throw off the yoke of Congregationalism and do something different. And these free will sects that I had mentioned before proliferated during that time. And particularly what these sects were doing is that they were challenging TULIP, okay, particularly the U and the L, if you remember. Free will, we can do this. And so, but not the Calvinist Baptists, because they were Calvinists. So there's sort of several sects I'm going to talk about, but one is the Calvinist Baptists. They were Calvinists, so they were a lot like the Congregational Church. And in fact, the only difference, okay, wait, before we go to the Baptists, I just want to look at some of what's on here. So the Baptists were the fastest growing sect. So again, I'm referring to a sect as anything that's not congregational. In 1780, 70% of all people living in Maine were Congregationalists and only 6% Baptist. In only, is that 3 decades later, only 20% are Congregationalists and 51% are Baptist. So in that 3 decades, you can see there's a great growth in the Baptist sect. This is Calvinist versus free will. So the difference being primarily that the Baptists believed in a believer's baptism. So in other words, the Congregationalists would do the halfway covenant. If someone professed, you could have your children baptized. They did it as an infant, which the Baptists complained about because they said, what does an infant know about, how they feel about God? So they believed that you had to actually have experienced this regeneration and then get baptized as an adult. And that was the primary difference between the Calvinist Congregational Church and the Calvinist Baptists at that time. There is one other difference, however, and that is all of these sects, the Baptists, the Methodists, the Quakers, all of the other sects, actually the Shakers, believed in itinerant preaching, which means that because the Congregational churches were supported by the foundation of the Puritans' beginnings in Massachusetts, all of their churches were supported by the taxes of the people who lived in the area. So whether you attended that church or not, if you lived in the parish, which was this particular area around the church, you paid taxes to support the minister. And eventually people started getting a little upset about that. And so what happened, though, is all these sects started just having somebody who wasn't paid go around and preach, from standing on a rock. And there was lots of conflict about that with respect to the Congregationalists, because they're like, well, you're not an educated minister, what can you say? So, but that was one of the things, one of the hallmarks of the sects, if you will, is that they did itinerant preaching. Now, I'm showing this map of Maine so we can think about what was going on in Maine. So Maine is a huge state, you all know, and in fact, it's the size of, it's bigger than all the rest of New England put together. So what we've got in Maine is this long coastline, but there's a gigantic area of inland space. And so this area was like, because of shipping, et cetera, the coastal area was connected to the global economy, but, and different cities and towns. But what happened is, as people start moving inland, they're no longer tied to the Congregational church. And in fact, they don't have ministers, because they all of the original settlements and churches were right along the coast. And so they were more susceptible to these sects, itinerant preaching. So from 1780 to 1820, Maine's population grew 6-fold. The Congregational churches increased only 2.5-fold during that time. In 1790, only 1/5 of the towns in Maine had a Congregational church, and only 1 in 24 of these was in the rural interior. By 1816, more than 130,000 religious people were without regular preaching. So you can see what the challenge was here in Maine. There's just a lot of land, people are moving inland, and they've got no preachers. So along comes the itinerant Baptist, they're ready to listen. So this is just a very nice painting showing a Methodist meeting just out in the woods. They'd meet out in the woods wherever they could. There was a man named the Reverend Joseph Field, who was a Congregationalist, who actually went on a journey, and he wrote down what he experienced. He went all throughout Maine to just sort of see what was happening. And he described this Methodist camp meeting in 1805. I just want to talk to you a little bit about, so you can sort of hear the judgment, I guess, associated with the Congregationalist view and what this looked like. So he says, July 3rd, 1805, It was to the highest degree enthusiastic and disorderly. The confusion of a mixed company consisting of some hundreds of any kind of posture and exercise, some preaching with a few to listen and hear, others situated upon the ground. A multitude of both sexes stood praying and clapping their hands to help forward their travail and to bring them to conversion. Others were on their knees together, considerable number praying with the utmost violence of voice and gesture, and many other things, singing, crying glory to God. Amen. Come, Lord Jesus, so far exceeds description that the most animated attempt to set it forth must be quite dull and insipid compared with the reality. So there's his description of what one of these Methodist camp meetings was like, and you can hear he was very disapproving. Now, just looking at the town of North Yarmouth, here's a survey from 1727. Those of you who know North Yarmouth and Yarmouth history know that the original plantation of North Yarmouth was very big. Okay, this is the Royal River in the center, so it's about 10 miles wide and 8 miles this way. So it's a gigantic space. And so the church was right about here, and it served all of this area plus down in Harpswell. So you can see that even North Yarmouth itself was potentially susceptible to sects that could come in and preach to people who lived in what I'll refer to in this talk as the backlots, the area that's now Cumberland and North Yarmouth. Those were the backlots. So there was this vast inland area, but they were tied to the church basically through their connections through Gilman. So now let's talk about the Reverend Tristram Gilman, 1735 to 1809. So Gilman was born in 1735 in New Hampshire. He nearly died in childbirth. He fell from a horse as a toddler. He recovered from a serious illness when 2 of his elder brothers died. And in 1770, he was crossing a bridge over the Malsom River, and it went out just after he crossed it. So this is a man who nearly experienced death several times. So he felt that the Lord had preserved him for a reason. And the reason that he believed it was that he was destined to follow his father in the ministry. He attended Harvard and graduated in 1757, got his second degree in 1761, and began teaching in Exeter. Now here, the interesting thing about Gilman is not only was he strongly affected by his near-death experiences, he was also very much affected by his father, the Reverend Nicholas Gilman, 1707 to 1748. So here's a picture of him. They're both wearing wigs, you can see. It turns out that his father was very personal friends with George Whitefield. Remember the man who was the itinerant minister, very involved, sort of defined or started the First Great Awakening, and these guys were friends. So he was very influenced by Whitefield, and when he preached, he actually ended up sort of having that sort of enthusiastic experience in church, but it didn't go well for him. In fact, he died when Tristram was only 12, and he actually left his pulpit and, kind of disgraced because his people in the church were having a very disorderly experience where they were doing things like what I described by that the Methodists were doing out in the woods, which wasn't right for Congregationalists. So basically it was not a good experience. And so Tristram Gilman was, although he had the influence of Whitefield, he did also experience and see what happened to his father in his father's church. So basically what we might say is that Tristram probably was a little bit wary about too much enthusiasm. Gilman was given the call to the First Parish Church in 1769, and I've actually looked at the vote for him. So 29 were in favor of him coming that were church members. So I've got church members here. 29 were in favor, 13 opposed. 69% of the people who were actually members, so had experienced regeneration. The parish, so the parish means they're not church members, they just live in the area but they come to church there. 49 said yes, 29 no, 63%. So this was a little bit of a split vote, and he was somewhat concerned about it. But he decided, and actually when I looked at this, like what was going on with the people that voted against him, most of the people who voted against him had protested the former minister, whose name was Edward Brooks, removal, and he was an Arminian. So you're seeing that at the time that Gilman showed up, there were some people that had Arminian ideas. And nevertheless, Gilman did accept the call, and he built a house about 1770, which is still standing there. He took a wife and built this house, which is still standing here on Route 88. It's right there. This is a photo from the Yarmouth History Center's collections of what the house looked like probably about 1900. Anyway, it's changed a bit, but it's still standing. That's Gilman's house, which was just down the road. The church was right here. So he was pretty close to where the church was. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Gilman's theology. What was he doing? What was he talking about? Well, it turns out that his reaction to the sects, that sort of after he'd been, so he was called in 1769, in the 1780s, the sects started coming around a lot. And he had some very proactive opposition to the sects. When Hezekiah Smith came and preached in North Yarmouth in 1772, he warned his people, don't go there. In 1793, he actually would attend the Calvinist Baptist preacher that would come and did some baptisms at the Fourth Falls, just like right there, actually, right over there. He was doing baptisms there, and Gilman showed up, and he said, warned them against strange fire and new lights. And he said, what I'm hearing here is truth, but it's no better than I can tell you. So, and he described in his sermons that some of the differences that you see are just preferences. They aren't really as important as the saving of your soul, if you will. So he really proactively reacted to the sects, which, as you'll see, ends up having a profound effect in what's going on. The most difficult group were the Calvinist Baptists, because, of course, they were Calvinists. So what are you going to say about them? So, in fact, we did get a Baptist church here formed, but it was a little bit later, not until 1796. The Baptist church, which is the meeting house on the hill. Here's our first minister, Reverend Thomas Green. Interestingly, 92% of the people who originally founded that church were unchurched, which means they were not members of the Congregational Church. So within Gilman's congregation, he was pretty successful keeping people from jumping over to the Baptist church. And importantly, I thought this was very interesting. Because they were Calvinists, you can see this in the records, the church records. If someone did go to the Calvinist Baptist church, they were not excommunicated. But Methodists and anyone else was. So again, it's about the free will theology. If you're a Calvinist, you're kind of okay, even if you believe that you should be immersed as an adult. I'm going to talk a little bit about Gilman's theology. There are 250 that I could find manuscripts of his sermons, so that's quite a number that have survived in 5 different institutions. And I didn't read every one, but I read quite a few of them. And there's also family papers and a diary. Interestingly, his diary, which includes the period of the revival, there's nothing, those pages are gone. Either he didn't record them or someone else took them, because we don't have any information from his actual lips about the revival, other than he talked about in one of his sermons that there was a quickening. He talked about the interest in the church. He was an Orthodox Calvinist, as I said, so like Jonathan Edwards. He was what I'll call a New Light moderate. So, and he was New Light in the sense that he was pro-revival. Obviously, his church had a revival, but he also was moderate in that sense probably because of his experiences with his father. He believed in the halfway covenant, which strict Calvinists would not. In other words, that you can prepare yourself a little bit by becoming part of, having your children baptized, basically. Here's some pictures that show some of his sermons. What was a revival? How did it happen? The people that were in the church believed that revival was a glorious work of God. In other words, the Calvinists believed, that it was something that God did, that they didn't have anything to do with it. If God wanted to cause a revival, he would cause a revival. And so they called it a glorious work of God. Historians, however, have tried to take a look at, and I did this as well, what was he preaching? And I learned quite a bit about what he was preaching right before the revival broke out. So what the historians talk about is that there was this passionate preaching, like a particular style. That was George Whitefield. He had been in theater, and so apparently he was very entertaining to watch. And so, is it something about the style, or was it particularly the message? This is a message by Jonathan Edwards, a famous sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I don't know if you've heard of this, but it's a very, very dramatic, emotional sermon describing how we're like spiders dangling over the fiery pits of hell. So, people would sort of cry. Apparently, Joe said that during the sermon you'd hear like crying and weeping, and people were really, really moved by the sermon, or maybe scared by it. So which of these things was playing a role in the revival? So This guy, a free will revivalist, Charles Finney, who is famous for the Second Great Awakening, believed that it was entirely the manner. In other words, it doesn't matter what you're saying, it's how you're saying it that is the most important. However, again, he's a free will person, so he's going to be someone who tends to think that there's more choice in what he's doing. I do know from looking at this that Gilman actually preached the same sermon in 1769, 1774, and during the revival. Okay, so it seems that it's not, at least in the case of this revival, not the same message. Not the message. In other words, not only the message. We do have a sermon that exists from February 20th of 1791 that was exactly 1 month before the revival started. And this is just an excerpt from the sermon, which I think is pretty impassioned. So he says, "The word in the hand of the Spirit is a great means of awakening, convincing, and converting sinners unto God." So you can see in his language here that he's saying it passionately, but he's also talking about the importance of the message, so, which would have been an Orthodox Calvinist view. So now I'm going to describe to you what was happening with the revival. Fortunately, we actually have an account of the revival written in the hand of Ammi R. Mitchell, some of you who know who he is, a character who was a doctor and ended up being sort of well known in Yarmouth. This was written down on February 21st, 1793, but it's referring to the very first description of the revival that happened on March 23rd, 1791. Interestingly, it happened in the backlots, the people who later became part of what's now the North Yarmouth and the Cumberland Church. That's where the revival began. And here's a description of it. So it happened at Walnut Hill, which is the village in North Yarmouth. It seems as if the deacons themselves started out being converted. So here's a description from this. "A serious solemnity then appeared to sit upon the countenance of the audience. After lecture, the Reverend Mr. Gilman called into a neighboring house where several of the hearers had stopped, with whom he conversed personally, pointedly, and affectionately upon the necessity of true religion. And all those persons with whom he personally conversed became hopeful subjects of Christ." So this began in the backlots, as I said, but later, through the revival, it became basically evenly distributed. The passage that he preached is actually described in here. It was something called "Almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian." So that's what he talked about. That's all we know. We don't have the sermon written down. But what happened was, after they noticed this new interest in religion, the deacons were inspired to go and converse with the various halfway members of the church. 2/3 of the first 12 who joined were halfway members, but by the end, more than 80% of the people who joined were not halfway members. They were people who were previously not at all involved in the church. There was, as I mentioned, a dramatic increase in religious interest. Weekday sermons at least once a week through September. We have other accounts of things that happened at the revival. According to a guy named Francis Brown, the church was filled to overflowing and people met in barns. So try to picture this, what was happening in town. According to Lewis, the guy who had the diary, the church members moved out of the front wall pews and sat in the body pews for the congregation to take the front of the meeting house in sacrament time. So just imagine what that might have looked like in a sort of a small church when suddenly there are all these new people here and the people that were members just sort of stood back and let them come in, which is kind of amazing. Gilman did mention that the people in the church were quickened. So this is actually, as I mentioned, there were 250 sermons. This is actually a chart that shows 93 of them plotted for when they were written. So I just looked at the date when they were written, and what you can see starting from 1770 to 1805 is that early in his career, he wrote a lot more sermons, and you notice this very lack of sermons during this time period. And I'm like, why is that? Why do we not? I mean, I wanted to read the sermons that he had written during the revival and see what he was saying, but there isn't a lot there, and I'm going to show you why I think that is. Very few sermons were actually written. In fact, there were exactly 5 that I saw that are referred to having been preached. They weren't even written then. There were only 2 that were actually written that I found during the revival period. So where are the rest? I found this at the Maine Historical Society, and this is called Notes from 1785. What this is it's a sermon where he didn't write everything out. All the other sermons that I've looked at, all the 250, handwritten word by word. He'd stand up there on church day and read it word by word. Okay, and it would take all day. They would break for lunch. So, well, actually, they'd do a second sermon in the afternoon. But anyway, In about 1785, Gilman started writing notes and just referring, so bullet points, if you will. And that's the first time I saw that happening. But interestingly, that's the kind of thing that his father did, and a lot of these ministers who were like pro-revival ministers, they didn't actually write their sermons down. They just would stand up there and they'd preach whatever came out of them. And they would believe that the Holy Spirit was guiding what they were saying. And so you start to see Gilman do that. And I thought, well, could that be what's going on here? Is he getting a little more impassioned? Does something happen to him? Because you see a huge change in that. And in fact, when I started looking carefully at some of his sermons, you can see here that, so this sermon, the whole, it's 10 pages. Then we have, when he first preached it, and the second time he preached it here, and this is the first time I saw that, with extemporaneous enlargement. So what that means is after he preaches this, he stays up there and keeps on preaching, something that just is coming to him. And I started seeing that a lot after that time period. Okay, so EX editions, on this time, 1790. And I looked at all the examples. So I found like 7 or 8 examples, and they all happened. The first one was 1789, 1790, 1791. There were 3 examples that exist. And 80% of all of the listings of extemporaneous editions were during the revival. So what I actually think is going on is that he was doing plenty of extemporaneous preaching, and in fact, that's why you don't see written sermons during that time period. Is I believe that they weren't written down, that he was just preaching extemporaneously, or extempore as they call it. As a new minister, he was a bit uninspired. We've got some quotes where, from a guy named Jeremiah Powell in 1770, Mr. Gilman don't shine on these occasions in his performances. So there's some evidence that his early preaching may not have been so enthusiastic. But something happened by the mid-1780s where he was his message was a little more focused on the heart, I'd say, than the head, which was a little more emotional than rational. And it seems that he had undergone a change, and there's lots of descriptions of various people that knew him. After Walnut Hill, someone said he was discoverably a man of increased spirituality and fidelity. So it seems that, and maybe it was because of his experience with, going around to visit all the sects, something happened to him in the 1780s, it appears. And in fact, we can see that. I'm going to skip ahead because I think I'm taking a lot of time. I have no idea. It's 9 o'clock already. So anyway, other people have had that experience where they've been inspired by other ministers, including the Reverend Thomas Smith, who listened to Whitefield, and he found himself trying to preach like Whitefield. That's what he wanted to do. I do want to look at this sermon because this is the one of only 2 that exist, that were written right during the time period, okay, right in the thick of it. This is 6 months after the revival starts. And one of the things that's kind of fun about this sermon, it came from the Houghton Library at Harvard. This appears to be wine. It's got a little stain. So and I looked it up, and in fact, that was what they call the Lord's Day. So they were having communion, and he spilled it on his sermon. This sermon is very, what I'll call evangelical and emotional. Why will you not sinners cast away this unbelief from you and be persuaded to come to the fountain that you may be cleansed? Gilman did not, especially during the revival that we know of, didn't talk about terrors of the law, the kind of thing that I talked about, sinners in the hands of an angry God, that Jonathan Edwards did. Gilman didn't do that, but a lot of his language is very, especially during this time period, is very emotional. The thing that I discovered that I think is most interesting about what was he preaching during the revival is that over the period right before and for the next 8 weeks, he preached sequentially from one verse to the next. And he'd never done that before. Okay, so he starts out, and it's first, if anybody wants to look it up, 1 Peter 2, 1 through 2, October 31st, 1790. And the next time he preaches, 1 Peter 2, 3. So just one verse. Okay, so it's not even the whole chapter. It's one verse. And the next one is 1 Peter 2, 5. He skipped 4, interestingly, there. And the next one is 1 Peter 2, 6 through 7. 1 Peter 2, 7 through 8. 1 Peter 9. 1 Peter 10, revival breaks out, March 27th. And the following, he completed that 8-week of 1 Peter 2. He had a guest minister that summer Mr. Craig, who actually preached on verse 4, the one that he had missed. So I don't know what it all means, but he was clearly pretty focused on that. And for fun, if you guys are interested, you could look that up later and just see what he was preaching. Another thing that's kind of, I was sort of looking at and thinking about was, there's a lot of, if you read about revivals, people don't know what causes them, and historians have been trying to understand. And one of the things that people have talked about is, what about the role of death and fear, for example? If people are afraid of death, does that make them more likely to want to join the church, want to become involved? And so basically, this is kind of fun. I found this document, which is a description of a letter that Gilman wrote to General George Washington right after Falmouth Neck was cannonaded, as he said. I love that word. So you guys all know, right 6 months into the American Revolution, the British pulled up here right alongside Falmouth Neck, and this red line shows the part that they decimated by cannons. And so 8 days later, Gilman was afraid. So he wrote this letter to Washington pleading him to come help. We, the inhabitants of North Yarmouth and New Gloucester, beg leave to acquaint your excellency that we in these and the neighboring towns are greatly alarmed and distressed by the desolation of a great part of the town of Falmouth, which was on Wednesday last cannonaded and set on fire by some of His Majesty's ships of war, the particulars of which we suppose your excellency has already received in some other way. We've been informed their design was next to destroy North Yarmouth. They were actually worried about that. But that which gives us the most painful apprehension is a jealousy that their design is to take possession of Falmouth Neck and fortify an eminence there, from which we judge it would be most difficult, if not impracticable, to dislodge them. So basically he's saying, George, we're really worried, please come. I mean, George was busy elsewhere. But you can see from this that they were afraid. And so the question is, this was going on. Were there more people joining during that time? As I said, no. If you just look through straight memberships, that was a time, the American Revolution was a time when interest in religion was extremely low. But what you do see, which is kind of interesting, is I've plotted here the relative number, the ratio of baptisms to births. And what you do see is during American Revolution time, there is sort of a general trend where there's more baptisms. And that's what other researchers have found, that what does happen when people are afraid of death or other things. In fact, you see that in the 1730s when there was a lot of throat distemper. People would baptize their children at a lot higher rate. People would come to church, but it did not affect the membership. Okay, the membership, there were more people that were baptized during this time, but the membership wasn't any different during the American Revolution. In fact, if anything, there were less members that joined. Briefly about the role of the laity. You guys know the word laity. It means the people who go to the church, the people who sit in the pews. What I found is that there were a number of influential lay members, which I'll describe. I think of them like the biological concept of a keystone predator. The reason being that the way to think of this is like not everyone in the food chain is the same. There are some members of the food chain, keystone predators, that have a bigger effect because their lives sort of and their actions sort of affect other people. And so I think of these influential lay people as like keystone predators. And the family that was particularly this was the Mitchell family. David Mitchell had been a very important member of the church, and he had two sons, Ami Rahama Mitchell and Deacon Jacob Mitchell. Ami was actually, he's the one that wrote the revival account, and he actually joined as a revivalist and did lots of things to help convert other people, if you will, or encourage religion in the town. And his older brother actually was a community member as well. So one of the things I mentioned before, I think, is that there was many prayer meetings that happened during this time. There was so much interest in religion. They were having all these sermons, even during the week, and groups would gather together, and Ami Mitchell was one of them that was leading one of these prayer groups, where they would sing and discuss religious ideas. And there's a record that the professors awoke and prayed for the effusion of the Spirit. So there's lots of this sort of thing happening as well. And so here's my cartoon illustrating what happens with a revival is it seems to me that things sort of get going. A bunch of different things kind of, Gilman maybe experienced some kind of awakening himself. He started preaching extemporaneously. He got some of the deacons and influential members of the church involved, and suddenly before you know it, you're rolling downhill at high speed. And that's how I it's almost like a social epidemic. One person affects lots of others, and the inspired ministers and lay leaders can actually affect many, many people. During this time, there were other ministers. Gilman was so overwhelmed with all of the interest in religion, he had to get ministers from other towns. So 18 different ministers preached 33 times, mainly weekday sermons, because Gilman himself did something like 90% of the sermons on Sundays. During this period in June, 7 sermons in 8 days. So this is a town that's pretty on fire and interested in religion. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit, if I still have time, I don't even want to ask what time it is, about some stats and demographics. This is the most interesting part of my talk, I think. Okay, so I'm looking at things like men, women, age, marriage, who are the people who joined the revival? So at the beginning of Gilman's ministry in 1769, there were 52 men that were members of the church and 55 women. That represented 26% of the town. So you could see it wasn't a huge percent. By 1790, though, only 15% of the town were church members. And that's because the town is growing, and you don't have the number of so-called elect or saints who are keeping up. And only 14% of the male voters. By 1793, 28% of the male voters were members. So you can see that the revival itself caused a big jump just in sort of the influence in town, if you will, just because so many more men had joined the church. So I'm going to use the term revivalist to describe the people who joined during the revival and what were their characteristics. This man here, Joseph Gilman, who is actually Tristram Gilman's son, was 19 when he joined the church and became a member of this revival. The important point about the revivalists, when I looked at all of them, because there are records, they were young, okay? Most were about 30 years old. The average age was 32, young people. These were similar demographics to the first and second Great Awakening. The other point about them is that they were married, and many of them joined with their spouses. Now we're going to look at gender. So if any of you go to church, you probably look around at church and notice that there's a large number of women there. That's been true since basically early Puritan times, beyond when the Puritans first showed up, it was about half and half. But by the second generation of Puritans, there had already started to be more women in church, and that has been true throughout, except for a very particular point in time, and guess what that time is? Surprise, revival. Okay, so 1770 to 1790, the First Parish Church, was 60% women, 40% men. During the revival period, 52% women and 48% men. So you can see there's a huge increase in the percent of men. There's still more women, but the men have increased a lot. And then after the revival period, we go back to this sort of skewed, many more women. Historians think it's because women have a nature that's a little more perhaps amenable to religious interest, more humble and open, if you will. I'm not talking about myself, but just in general, that's what historians think, that women tend to join churches a lot more and stay with churches. But you do see this very interesting, even with the First Great Awakening and the change from men in southern New England went from 40 to 44% of men. So you do see a real differential with men joining during the revival. So now let's see what the role of marriage. 80% of the revivalists were married. Okay, 84% women, 76 men. Okay, so this is a little bit hard to understand, so just stay with me here. 28% had partners who never joined. So about a third of them who joined during the revival, their married partner never joined, okay? 76% of the time, those were women, okay? And that's an important point, because if the women joined first, they had a harder time getting their husband to join. But you'll see that if the men joined first, the women just came right along. And that's in line with what I was saying, that women sort of joined churches more readily. 72% had partners who joined at the same time, or joined before or after the revival, or joined during the revival at different times. Okay, and here's the big dramatic summary of the important thing that I found in my research. Of those couples who joined during the revival at different times, for 12 of the 14, the husband joined first. 86% of the time, the first one to join was the male partner. So what this shows, I think clearly, is that the men were the subjects of the revival. Okay, more women joined, looking percentage-wise, but the real difference in the revival was what happened to the men. Of the couples who both joined the church, 25% were before the revival and 67% during the revival. The other partner joined within 3 years or soon after. So this shows that revival made married partners evangelical, especially the men. Now, there was also a role of families. I looked at these numbers and found that more than 60% of the revivalists were closely related to another revivalist, excluding married couples. So siblings, cousins, parents, children. So this shows, too, that when they became interested in religion, that sort of spread, as you'd expect, like the snowball effect. So this graph is actually looking at baptisms also increased during the revival. Births shown. This is the revival period right here. This is births, this is baptism. So you see this increase in baptisms, and it turns out when I looked at the data, it showed that the increase in baptisms were the people, those young people, who had joined the church and they got their children baptized. Most of them had never been part of the church before. Most of them were not halfway covenanters. They just became interested and they baptized their children. And so you see this big increase in the number of baptisms at that time as well. I think I might skip this. Basically, this is some information about the halfway covenant on membership, that you see that what happens is during and after the revival, you see a decrease in the number of the effect of the halfway covenant. So basically, 1/4 to 1/3 of the halfway members became full members but that was doubled during the revival. The revivalists were previously uninterested in religion. That's the important point for you to know here. Look, I'm almost done. Now I'm going to talk about the legacy of the revival. This is Tristram Gilman's headstone. He's remembered fondly in the church. He's remembered for the revival. Historians refer to the revival, although no one has studied it in detail. He is known as a minister who experienced a revival during his near 40-year pastorate. But there's some other important things that came out of the revival, and I'm going to just talk about those now. The revival actually strengthened the congregational churches, particularly because it kept the sects at bay, even in the backlots. Remember I was telling you that area that's kind of far away from the church, they're a little more susceptible. And so the Calvinist Baptists, as I mentioned here, is the Calvinist Church, Baptist Church, 1796, only 18% of them were from the backlots. Okay, and as I mentioned before, 92% of them were already unchurched. So basically, this church was sort of filling a need that wasn't there. They kind of roused up people who sort of weren't interested in religion before. The Free Will Baptists and the Methodists only formed in the backlots in 1831, well after the revival period. The Universalists, you've got the years here, Methodists in the village proper, 1848. Unitarians, the Shakers and Quakers never succeeded here. So what this data shows, especially if you compare, which I did in my thesis, but I won't go into here, is how different it was in like the neighboring town of New Gloucester. New Gloucester had 26 itinerant preachers who came between 1780 and 1807, that period when there were lots of itinerants. North Yarmouth had 1 during that same time period. So I attribute this to the effect of Gilman particularly being proactive and how the congregational churches were strengthened through that great insurgence of new members and new enthusiasm for religion. It also strengthened orthodoxy. So what do I mean by that? As I mentioned, between 1730 and 1769, all of the ministers were Harvard educated. But during that late 18th century period, Boston particularly, is, if you know the religious history there, a lot of the churches, the congregational churches, became Unitarian, again, Arminian, right? A divergent from the Orthodox view of Calvinism. Because I think of the revival and the strengthening of the churches there here in North Yarmouth, the next 3 ministers that were chosen after Gilman, he died in 1809, were from Dartmouth, which is a pro-revival college. They were educated here. They never again had a Harvard, well, I don't know about never again, maybe in current years, but Never again in recent times did they have a Harvard-educated minister. After that, they had some from Andover Theological and Bowdoin, which were both strict Calvinists. Even in the backlots, the Rufus Anderson was a Hopkinsian. Remember, he was someone who was involved in the new divinity, like hyper-Calvinism. So you can see there's a strong interest, and I think born of the revival, of staying in this sort of more strict Calvinist view. The Unitarians were entirely excluded from North Yarmouth until 1886. I know from looking at records that when people left the First Parish Church, they actually went to known Orthodox Calvinist church, like the Third Parish Church in Portland. This man, Reverend Edward Payson, he was known as Praying Payson, or very Orthodox. And we've got records showing that if people moved to Portland, this is the church they went to, and they had other choices. So it seems like they were very rooted in Orthodoxy. And another important point is that 2 new churches formed out of the revival. 72% of those who were dismissed to Anderson's 1793 church had joined during the revival. So there's all these new people, many of them living in the backlots. They need new churches. So we've got the Cumberland Congregational Church, 1793, and North Yarmouth Congregational Church shown here, 1794 to 1795. This just shows when they were, the current edifices that are shown here were built, but the church predates those edifices, and they came directly out of this revival. One last series of important points. The congregational system helped propagate the sects. It was challenging for Maine's interior, as I said. The educated ministers and the church buildings just couldn't keep up with the need for religion in the inland areas of Maine. The halfway covenant also gave the sects something to sort of pick at, if you would. You know, that was a challenging doctrine, and a lot of the sects just took it apart and did different things. The profile of the revivalists, they were married with children, age about 30. They were baptized into the church, but they were not halfway members for the most part. Men were the subjects of the revival. That's my wonderful finding. If you read about revival now, people will say it's, you know, more women join. So it must be that women are the ones who are affected by revival. But I think my research here shows that, in fact, it was the men who were more responsive to the revival. Revivals then can be considered as periods of unusual religious interest among men. As I mentioned, I believe that this was an isolated event that was not at all part of the Second Great Awakening that started about 1800. It didn't happen for some decades after this revival in Maine. It was starting down in like Connecticut in about 1800. But it really was an isolated small event that was just affecting this church, or the 3 churches, depending on how you want to think of it. This is my last slide, what caused the revival, just as a little illustration of what I've talked about here tonight. The religious climate at the time was sex in the 1780s. The minister responded, greater vigilance. Gilman seems to have had some sort of spiritual awakening based on the way he was preaching and the kinds of things he was preaching. He started extemporaneous preaching in about 1789. His wife died. Can't remember if I mentioned that. I don't think I did. His wife died in 1790, late 1790, and it was right after, just some months after that, that the revival happened. So undoubtedly that had some effect on him. Passionate delivery and Calvinist message was fanning the flame. His preaching and other preachers as well inspired deacons and lay leaders who then continued to fan the flame. And importantly, men experienced awakening and became evangelical, leading to this wonderful revival. That's all. Thank you. Does anyone have questions? Or Katie has a question. Yes, Katie.
So that idea of depravity, you know, like child is born like flooded with sin and then, you know, has to be
saved,
right? When did that turn around? I mean, we don't. All religions have that belief. Do we have that belief?
Well, that's a good question. I can't answer.
Okay. I just wondered if there was it's complicated.
It's complicated, and it depends on their religion and all that kind of stuff. I mean, Catholics believe such a thing, don't they?
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Plymouth colony. You met the Pilgrims?
Yeah,
Okay.
and their surrounding areas.
Okay, and the significance of the Plymouth colony was that they were open to revival?
They were New Light, what I'd call New Light, so pro-revival, yes. And many of the first people who came to North Yarmouth and settled in the 1730s were from the Plymouth colony. So not just Plymouth, but the surrounding, like Kingston, and what are some of the other ones that are right around town?
The Puritans came in north of Boston, that was the Puritans.
Yeah,
and
around
the Pilgrims
Boston.
were south of Boston in Plymouth. And that's an interesting difference. I was interested in the fact that the Pilgrims were more interested in revival.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? I'm not sure I can answer why, but I know that's true. That'll take another paper, another dissertation maybe. Well, sorry I kept you guys so long. I didn't have a clock. I felt like I was talking a lot, but I'm happy to hang around here if you have questions, you want to talk to me personally. But thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. And thank you.